Okay, well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thanks for waiting. I know we're just a few minutes late. I wanted to gather today to talk about an issue that's confronted our region for a number of months now. The question is the expansion of a landfill, in this case the Keystone Sanitary Landfill. This is an issue that we've heard from a lot of people about across this region. And I think in an unusual demonstration of and recitation of people's opposition to the expansion. When people raise concerns about the impact of any decision that's made in a region like ours, especially a decision about the expansion of a landfill, and when they raise questions that relate to health or safety or quality of life or the environment or any other concerns that they have, I have a duty to respond. That's why in November, on specifically November 25th, I sent a letter to the Environmental Protection Agency, which was a transmittal letter that had enclosed within it a lot of the letters I had received up to that point in time, prior to or during the month of November up to that time. And when people continue to raise concerns, and you get more letters and more communication, I think it's important to make sure that not only the EPA has that information, but in this case, because it's a state regulatory matter, that the Department of Environmental Protection have the same letters, and of course letters that have come after the time that I sent the EPA letter. So that's what I'll be talking about today mostly. The letters I'll be sending, letters, communication, email of all kind. And part of that responsibility that I have is to give voice to those letters. Anyone can, of course, express an opinion to a state or federal regulatory body, but I believe that when I receive those, that's important that we get those to the agency, in this case, that has direct regulatory responsibility, DEP, but also the EPA that plays a role as well, and not as direct as DEP. Part of the debate is the regulation of solid waste. How do we do that as a community, as a Commonwealth, and as a country? And there's a lot to talk about under that broad umbrella of that regulatory challenge. I'll walk through the kind of the highlights of the letter, but I want it to be clear. This is a transmittal letter, so it's talking about what's enclosed. It's talking about some of the legal background, so to speak, in terms of regulation. But what it doesn't say is what I should say, which is I'm opposed to the expansion of the landfill. I say that as both a public official, but also as a citizen who lives in Lackawanna County, who was born and raised here, and who is still a resident of the Hill section. It's unusual to express an opinion about an issue that is a state regulatory matter and is a particular issue in a community. And I don't do this very often. But there are times when I think it's important to not just state an opinion, but to be responsive to the concerns that have been raised in a community. Let me just highlight the content of the letter. I say in pertinent part, in terms of the correspondence I received, I say, and I'm quoting the letter now, they, meaning my constituents, have expressed significant concerns about the expansion, particularly with respect to environmental concerns, quality of life, health concerns, congestion, traffic associated with the proposed expansion. And then I say after that, I share many of these concerns and ask that you, in considering the permit for expansion, ensure that approval, if granted, is predicated on assurances that community concerns are addressed, unquote. It's directed to John Quigley. He's the acting secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. When I transmit that information, I don't make a judgment about whether those concerns are valid or not, or whether they're accurate, or whether you can prove them. That's not my role. And when I express an opinion, that's, of course, just my opinion. But I think it's important that we have a full debate on this. That's why later in the letter, after citing the primacy of state law here, that I say that community concerns about the expansion are substantial, and then I go on from there. In the last paragraph, I raise the question about what folks have asked me, not just to raise the concern about the expansion, but also to specifically ask for more opportunities for public dialogue and public hearings. I say that some of my constituents have expressed concerns that DEP's review process has not given them adequate ability to ask questions. They have requested that DEP hold an additional public meeting to address remaining questions. I encourage you to grant this additional meeting request. And then I say, in addition to that, that there ought to be ample time and opportunity so that everyone can express their views. So that's the content of the letter. And I may send other letters like this to DEP or EPA as time goes forward. But I have to tell you, the letters and the emails and the correspondence we receive is of an intensity and a nature that is unusual, even for an issue that's been the subject of great debate. I wouldn't keep you all here and read every letter, of course. Some of them are very short, some of them are very long, some of them are full of assertions about what could happen, what might happen, what an expansion might mean. But I think the most compelling parts of these letters were personal statements that people had about this community, about their own families, the generation before them, the generation after them, and concerns about the future. And again, I can't evaluate those. It's not my role to evaluate what is accurate in those assertions or concerns. But just some highlights. And this, when I recite these, these are often themes that have come up very often in the correspondence. One very early letter said, highlighted the following, about the raising of families in a healthy and safe environment. And that concern was repeated over and over again. The concern that people have about health and safety. Now, that's part of why we're having a debate. We have to ask those questions and demand answers to those basic questions. Another theme which I think is very compelling is, I'm quoting from a letter, quote, "We've taken our share," unquote. Meaning that, and they're not speaking for a commonwealth or even a state or even a region necessarily. In this case, I think what they're saying is that we have to regulate and make judgments about the movement of solid waste. The Interstate Commerce Clause says it has to move between and among states without any barriers to it. That's what it is to be a country. But we've got a big state and we've got a big region, and one of the concerns that's been raised is how much can not just one region or one county, but a small portion of one county and one region. In this case, Dunmore and Troop, and you might expand beyond that. So the question is, one of the questions I should say is that has Dunmore and Troop, have they taken their fair share? And is there a limit about which one community can take? I think that's a very legitimate concern. Do one or two communities have to bear such a substantial burden 10 years down the road or longer? A third theme that was raised was the effect on individual families, the concerns that people had about their own health, or the health of their children, or the health of their family overall. One letter, and this was repeated in various ways depending on how many children someone had or whether they were boys or girls, but this is just one example. Quote, "The effect on my boy's health." That was one of the lines that one parent wrote. And that's a consideration that we have to weigh and debate. And we've got to debate it, obviously, based upon the facts and the science and what we can determine. And then fourth, and these are just broad themes, but fourth is just the height. That's a real concern for people. It's one thing to have a landfill and dealing with that difficult question of how we handle solid waste. It's another thing to have a landfill keep growing over time, where the height of it becomes as high as a mountain. And does the community have to accept that? And that's also an open question, and frankly a difficult question. So that's kind of the summary of what will be transmitted. And part of this is a debate about our community, and to a large extent our Commonwealth. We had a long history, long before I was growing up, about what happens to a community when a particular industry or economic sector that may create energy in the case of coal, or has to deal with solid waste in the case of landfill. What happens to a community over time when we don't make the right decisions about those industries or those sectors? And I think one of the reasons why this state became one of the leading states in terms of environmental protection, in terms of preserving open space, preserving our land, in making sure that we're making the right decisions about those issues. One of the reasons why we became one of the leaders after many generations of not leading was because of our history, mostly as it relates to coal and things we did the wrong decisions that we made about coal over many generations in terms of how you regulate that particular industry and what decisions you make. That led to a debate in the state about how we express that view of protecting our communities and making sure that we're protecting the communities we live in. In 1971, the voters ratified a new amendment to the Constitution, Pennsylvania Constitution, Article 1, Section 27, and it says in part, "The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment." A very powerful statement about the right of people. And then it goes on to say two things. One is, it says Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. Another theme that was in the letter, generations yet to come. It concludes by saying, "As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people." I cite that not because I think it's for this particular question, a controlling legal opinion or legal mandate. I cite it because, and some might say, well, that really speaks to open spaces and preserving national park or state parks, and it doesn't speak to this, and it speaks to the duty of officials necessarily, not necessarily the responsibility of citizens. Having said all that, and with all of those qualifiers, I think the broad theme of that constitutional provision has application here, not specifically in a legal context, but as application in this way. We have that statement in there not because we could pull it out and put it into a matter of dispute and win the argument. It's in our Constitution because we went so many generations of not making the right decisions, and we felt we had, as a people, that we had to have an assertion or a recitation of our values, what was important to us. That's why I think it's relevant to raise the themes of this. And the fact that it talks about natural, scenic, aesthetic values in the environment, I think there's some application here. But I think that maybe the most important part of it, in addition to the value statement, is the focus on the future, future generations. The decisions we make today as citizens, as public officials, as a community, and as a commonwealth have huge implications for the future. We don't just make these decisions for the next couple of years or even in the next decade. We should be making these decisions with an eye towards and a respect for those who will come after us. And we are, in a sense, trustees of the community we live in. And I think ever more so if you happen to be an appointed or elected official. So I think that, and I've always been inspired by that constitutional provision. It's a pretty direct message to elected officials, but I think it applies to all of us as citizens. So even if we don't use it as a specific controlling legal authority, I think we can use it by way of inspiration and by way of example as to what our obligations are. So that's the letter, and that's the news about the letter and about my concerns about this. But I wanted to open up for questions.
Senator, can you give us any idea of how many letters you've received from the public? Have they been?
Yeah, I should have said that, Eric. Thanks for mentioning that. John, it was 300 some, and then 125, and there's a third number, but
total of 300.
300.
So 175 pieces of correspondence, and then
Right.
125.
That's staff work.
So what was the total there? 375, John?
Well, a combination of letters and emails. So
Okay.
that's
So 300 just to the Scranton office.
300 of the Scranton office, yeah. Any other questions about it? Yes.
Yes, Senator. Councilman Timber from Dunmore. Part of my worry and part of Dunmore Council's worry was if you were following the negotiations. At first, it seemed a bit intimidating. We were not allowed a lawyer to be allowed into negotiations. As we all know, Dunmore hasn't had a contract never had a contract. In 30 years, the state never brought the fee up for landfill. It stayed at the same. We got the 41 cents for 30 years. Dunmore Council was worried. Now, I'm not the only one that stood up against phase 3 of the landfill. I was the only one that voted against the contract. But Dunmore, if anybody that attended the Dunmore Council meeting seen the pressure, and it was brought up many times, that there was no trust in DEP. And that is one of my concerns, and I think a lot of people in the audience are concerned there was no trust in DEP. That Dunmore rushed into this contract knowing we could get nothing out of this with no faith in DEP.
Well, and DEP has, I said the word primacy before, that's the right word. They have, since 1994, after the EPA made a determination, the EPA had to make a determination based upon 1984 amendments to a federal statute. It empowered the EPA to make a determination about a state's permit program. The EPA determined in 1994 that the DEP's permit program was adequate, and therefore that they would do they would be in charge of the permitting of landfills, or the permitting of an expansion. So that's the role that DEP plays, but we're still in the, maybe not the early stages, but still in the I don't know if we're at the midpoint, or depending on how many days you put on the table for this decision made by DEP. But that remains to be seen whether DEP will do the job that they're supposed to do, which is to provide ample opportunity for public comment and to give people a voice. Even if an individual, the law doesn't say you get a voice if you have a lawyer. You have a voice if you have a spokesperson or a voice in the law says that you have to give people a chance to express their opinion. So it remains to be seen, and I'm not going to make a judgment about DEP because it's, I think for me to make that's premature, but we still have a number of months ahead of us, and we'll see how they do.
Senator Casey,
Yes.
I just want to thank you on behalf of Friends of Lackawanna for being our voice, as you said at the beginning of this, for giving a voice to the people who have been trying so hard to have their elected officials, who, as you say, are our trustees as well as our elected officials, trustees of the environment, and for stating that what we do need is time here. We have many questions that have gone either unasked or unanswered, and I think time is definitely necessary, and for also pointing out that there are some issues with the regulation. When we say enough, it's because there's literally no end to how much garbage at this point we can take by the regulations. So thank you so much on behalf of the citizens for doing what so many elected officials have not done, and for being our voice. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Look, and I appreciate the fact that people are so engaged in a matter of significant importance to a community, but also to a county and a region. Often people don't get involved. They say that I've got my own life to lead, and I can't. I don't have the time or the inclination or the interest to get involved. I think it's a demonstration of the kind of system that we all hope our system of government is. That people get to petition their government and get to express their point of view, whether it's pursuant to the First Amendment or otherwise. So it's a great demonstration of public concern, and one of the things that we've got to make sure that we do as we go forward is to put on the table not just our views. I expressed an opinion today that I think the region would be better off without the expansion. But if I'm going to go beyond opinion and make assertions, I've got to have facts, and I think that's what we all have to make sure we do. Yes.
Senator Casey, I got involved in this. I mean, obviously I don't live in Dunmore, I live in Clarks Green. I got involved in this because I think it's a regional issue. I've actually had Friends of Lackawanna talk to the Abington Council of Governments. Is there any way that you can help to push the idea that it's a regional issue and that people in the outlying areas really should be paying attention to this?
Yeah, I think it's both a regional issue and I think it's a statewide issue in this sense. I mentioned before that we have federal statutes that speak to what happens or what must happen with regard to solid waste, and we obviously have the state's role in this. But this becomes a larger question, I think, of not just the specifics of landfills and solid waste, but how much does one community have to bear? Is the amount of solid waste in that community disproportionate to not only other parts of the Commonwealth but other parts of the region? And I think having a public debate about it is essential, but it's also essential in terms of are there other options here? That's one question that I would raise. So I think it is limited. The direct impact is limited to maybe 2 communities or 2 municipalities, but it certainly goes beyond the larger questions. Go beyond that. You remember, just a little note of history here. Back in, I forget what year it was, my father was standing at the border, the state border, with a group of folks from state government, the state police, DEP, or then known as DER, and other officials inspecting trucks as they came across the border. And that was, in that instance, probably the limits of their authority in terms of what they could do with the interstate commerce question about solid waste coming across the border. But at that time, someone might say, well, that issue doesn't apply beyond the particular site where that truck will go. But I think what he was raising was a larger question about how much does a Commonwealth have to take, and is that disproportionate? One, in this case, one state versus others. But I think this present debate raises, among other questions, that is it disproportionate to have one community have to endure for 10 years or 50 years what would flow from this decision?
Senator, you mentioned how unusual it is for you to take a position like this. Obviously, you could have stayed silent. What about the critics that say you might be using this for political gain? Is that a valid argument? Obviously, you've got a lot of people here that are very favorable to your message today, but those critics, what do you want to say to them?
Eric, that happens to me every day.
I know.
And no matter what you express an opinion about that, and look, that should be part of the debate as well. What is the role of a federal official in this kind of a question? That's part of the debate as well. But that's why we have a constitution. That's why we have a free society. A lot of countries in the world where we couldn't have this debate. It would be just cut off. There'd be no voice, no role for the people. But I'm prepared for criticism. That's kind of part of the job.
Have you gotten any letters in favor, or have they all been opposed?
I'm not aware of a communication in favor. I'll check. I mean, I'll ask John and our team to check for sure, but I'm not aware of it.
Senator, is there any momentum or a sense you get on a federal level that the United States as a country, it's largely regarded, we have antiquated waste management techniques across the country? Do you sense any level of federal interest to take a look as a countrywide solution to how we handle waste, not just particular to this landfill, but on a national level?
Not anything that has a bill or a current effort underway. But I think these kinds of debates, these kinds of disputes raise those questions as well as to what if anything the federal government can do to be responsive. We had the I want to read the exact everything's an acronym, RCRA, but the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That was a 1976 statute which had criteria for landfills, and then in 1984, just 8 years later, those criteria changed, and even though the specific regulatory power was still at the state level, but at that time, after the '84 amendments, the EPA promulgated a set of regulations that were entitled criteria for municipal solid waste landfills. And the regulations applied to landfills that receive household waste, and the requirements were location restrictions, operation design criteria, groundwater monitoring, corrective action requirements, closure and post-closure, financial assurance. So a series of criteria, and that's as far as the federal law went at that time. But it's a good question as to whether or not there should be a federal debate about what can be done. I do think, though, that part of the problem is in Washington is a lot of major issues have moved very slowly. So it's sometimes it's a question of space and time dedicated to a question like this. And we have to wrestle with what is a constitutional barrier. We may be frustrated by that, but it is a constitutional question as well. So it becomes, it's not something that you can address purely from a legislative or statutory or even regulatory perspective. So that's, maybe on another day we can have another conversation about that. But, ma'am? Yes?
Yes.
I know we have to go, but.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
My name is Jane Roberts, and I am a registered voter in the city of Scranton. And on behalf of the city of Scranton, Senator Casey, I want to thank you for your service. I remember your dad, and he was a great man, as we hope you will be too. Thanks for caring. A perfect example of the Dunmore landfill is the Taylor landfill. And that's a beautiful area that they've done and given back to the community. Why can't Dunmore do the same, make it more landscaped? You know, with your help, I'm sure that they will. But I thank you so much for your time, your service, and thanks for having us all here today.
Sure, thank you. Appreciate you
Thank
being
you.
here today. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, sir.
I got you right there.